Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 54, Assassination, Wild Bill, the KKK, and Black Codes. People tend to hold on to their views even when they appear to have been proven factually wrong. Belief perseverance is the propensity to adhere to one's initial opinion even after obtaining new details that conflict with or disconfirm the root of that view. Everyone has attempted to alter someone's sentiment, only to have them stubbornly stay intact. For example, the lost cause of the Civil War, or even the moon landing. In many circumstances, opposition to thoughts is rational and justifiable. I find myself to be a victim of this as well. As you know, I love dinosaurs. Even as a kid, my room was stuffed with toys and books about these thunder lizards. I loved them all, but I was especially fond of the Brontosaurus, a large sauropod, a group of typically giant dinosaurs with long necks and tails. It lived from about 156 to 145 million years ago during the late Jurassic period. The first recorded evidence of Brontosaurus was discovered in 1870s. But scientists had started to question whether the fossils used to name Brontosaurus came from another dinosaur, the remarkably similar Apatosaurus. In a 1903 publication, there was not enough similarities between the two dinosaurs to have them both exist. As Apatosaurus had been named first, its name was kept, and Brontosaurus became Apatosaurus. For over 100 years, the name Brontosaurus went unused by paleontologists, although the dinosaur certainly lived on in the minds of the public. As a small child in the 1980s, I relished the opportunity to correct adults on the correct term of Apatosaurus. I was a smug little jerk. But according to the London Natural History Museum website, the research published in 2015 used 81 specimens from worldwide collections and looked at 477 anatomical traits. The scientists eventually demonstrated that Brontosaurus was distinguishable from Apatosaurus, one of the major distinctions being that Apatosaurus was more massive and robust with a thicker and lower set neck than Brontosaurus. This was only feasible because paleontologists had found several new dinosaurs recently. Many paleontologists were ready and willing to welcome Brontosaurus back. I was not. I went through the 7 stages of grief, trying to conclude that the 5-year-old Ryan was wrong all this time, whether he knew it or not. Despite the historical and scientific data in front of me, I would have preferred to have been right versus being correct. Eventually, I came to terms with the discovery, and I welcome as many new dinosaurs as we can find. As I have mentioned, history needs room to breathe and shift as more and more information is discovered or reevaluated. We must cast off the tattered cloak of dogma that shrouds our inquiry and bask in the light of self-introspection. Just don't get me started on Pluto. It's a planet. This hill I will die on.
Lincoln Assassination. On the evening of April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate supporter, assassinated President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The attack came only 5 days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his massive army at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, effectively ending the American Civil War. John Wilkes Booth was a Maryland native born in 1838 into a household of prominent actors. Booth would ultimately take the stage, appearing in 1855 in Shakespeare's Richard III in Baltimore. Despite his Confederate compassion, Booth stayed in the North during the Civil War, pursuing a thriving career as an actor. But as the war entered its final stages, he and several associates hatched a plot to kidnap the president and take him to Richmond, the Confederate capital. Growing desperate, Booth devised an even more sinister plan to save the Confederacy. On March 20, 1865, the day of the planned kidnapping, Abraham Lincoln failed to appear at the spot where Booth and his 6 fellow schemers lay in wait, hindering their planned abduction. 2 weeks later, Richmond fell to Union forces, and on April 9, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. Learning that Lincoln was to attend Laura Keene's acclaimed performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., on April 14, Booth masterminded a plan even more sinister than abduction. He and his co-conspirators considered the simultaneous assassination of Lincoln, Vice President, and Secretary of State. The President and 2 of his possible successors would throw the U.S. government into disarray. The Lincolns arrived late for the comedy, but the President was reportedly in a fine mood and laughed jovially during the production. Lincoln occupied a private box above the stage with his wife Mary Todd Lincoln, a young Army officer named Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée, Clara Harris, the daughter of New York Senator Ira Harris. At 10:15, Booth slipped into the box and fired his .44 caliber single-shot Derringer pistol into the back of Lincoln's head. After stabbing Rathbone, who instantly rushed at him in the shoulder, Booth jumped onto the stage and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," or "Thus ever to tyrants," the Virginia state motto. At first, the crowd diagnosed the unfolding drama as part of the production, but a scream from the First Lady told them otherwise. Although Booth broke his leg in the fall, he managed to leave the theater and flee from Washington on horseback. A 23-year-old doctor named Charles Leal was in the audience and hurried to the presidential box immediately upon hearing the shot and Mary Lincoln's scream. He found the president slouched in his chair, paralyzed and laboring to breathe. Several soldiers carried Lincoln to a boarding house across the street and placed him on a bed. When the Surgeon General reached the house, he deduced that Lincoln could not be saved and would probably die at night. Vice President Andrew Johnson, members of Lincoln's cabinet, and several of his closest friends stood guard by the president's bedside in the boarding house. The First Lady lay on a bed in an adjacent room with her eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, at her side, overcome with shock and grief. Ultimately, Lincoln was pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, at 56. News of the president's death traveled quickly. By the end of the day, flags across the country flew at half-mast, businesses were shut, and people who had just alighted at the end of the Civil War now staggered from Lincoln's shocking assassination. On April 18, they carried Lincoln's body to the Capitol Dome. 3 days later, his remains were boarded onto a train that brought him to Springfield, Illinois, where he had lived before becoming president. Lincoln and his son, William Wallace Lincoln, who died in the White House of typhoid fever in 1862, were interred on May 4, 1865, at Oak Ridge Cemetery near Springfield. Tens of thousands of Americans lined the railroad route and paid their respects to their fallen leader during the train's solemn progression through the North. Mary Todd Lincoln was so overwhelmed that she took to her bed for weeks and missed the funeral. She was soon outcast from society for her vocal grief. As the nation grieved, Union soldiers were hot on John Wilkes Booth's trail, which many in the audience had instantly recognized. After fleeing the Capitol, he and an abettor, David Herold, made their way across the Anacostia River and headed towards southern Maryland. They sought sanctuary from Thomas A. Jones, a Confederate agent, before securing a boat to row across the Potomac to Virginia. The pair stopped at the home of Samuel Mudd, a doctor who treated Booth's broken leg. Mudd's actions earned him a life sentence that was later commuted. On April 26, Union troops encircled the Virginia barn where Booth and Herold were hiding and set fire to it, hoping to flush the fugitives out. As the blaze intensified, a sergeant shot Booth in the neck, allegedly because the killer had lifted his gun as if to attack. Herold yielded, but Booth stayed inside. Carried out of the building alive, Booth remained for 3 hours before gazing at his hands and uttering his last words, "Useless, useless." 4 of Booth's co-conspirators were sentenced for their part in the assassination and executed by hanging on July 7, 1865. They included David Herold and Mary Surratt, the first woman put to death by the federal government, whose boarding house had acted as a meeting place for the would-be kidnappers.
Wild Bill Hickok. James Butler Hickok arrived in Springfield, Missouri, in the summer of 1865, fresh off a tour as a Union scout and spy during the Civil War. The 28-year-old Illinois native was already known locally as Wild Bill. Still, there was little at the time to differentiate him from the countless other would-be gunslingers and card sharks wafting through the American backcountry. That would change on July 21, when Hickok arrived to meet a one-time Confederate soldier named Davis Tutt in the Springfield city square. The duel that followed vaulted Wild Bill to national fame. How Hickok and Tutt scowled at one another down the barrels of their 6 guns is not completely clear. The bad blood may have originated in a dispute over the affections of a lady, but it's also possible that lingering Civil War tensions were to blame. Everyone knew both men to haunt Springfield's poker rooms and saloons as semi-professional gamblers, and some witnesses claimed the pair had once been friends. Some reports even alleged that Hickok had killed one of Tutt's friends during the war. Whatever the source of the hostility, the Hickok-Tutt rivalry finally boiled over on July 20, 1865. That night, Hickok was playing poker at the Leon House Hotel when Tutt encountered him about a $35 debt from a previous card game. Hickok countered that the sum was only $25 and said he had a memorandum in his jacket pocket to prove it, but Tutt was skeptical. He snatched Hickok's beloved Waltham pocket watch off the felt and declared he would hold it as collateral until the debt was settled. When Hickok protested, he threatened to exhibit the timepiece in the town square the next day. A seething Wild Bill warned that Tutt wouldn't manage the stunt unless dead men can walk. Hickok and Tutt spent most of the next day arguing over the watch and the poker debt, but according to witnesses, neither man seemed particularly eager to slap leather against the other. The former pals even tried to settle the dispute over a glass of whiskey before Tutt grew frustrated and stalked away. Around 6 p.m., Tutt reappeared near the Springfield courthouse wearing Hickok's watch. Wild Bill walked out to meet him from across the town square, his hand dangling next to one of the Colt Navy guns, strapped to his sides. "Dave," he cautioned, "don't you come across here with that watch." Tutt dismissed him and began walking in Hickok's direction, his hand hovering over his gun. "Dave, don't come any closer," Hickok shouted. As the two men inched 75 yards of one another, they suddenly drew their pistols and aimed. Tutt and Bill fired, but one discharge followed the other so quickly that it was hard to say which went off first. In the end, it didn't matter who was faster on the draw. Tutt's shot flew harmlessly over Wild Bill's head while Hickok's bullet found its mark. Some accounts say he had Tutt shoot first and then fired his weapon after steadying it on his left hand. Bill never shoots twice at the same man, and his ball went through Dave's heart. After gurgling, "Boys, I'm killed," Tutt staggered a few steps toward the courthouse and fell dead. The bloody exchange had lasted just a few seconds. Hickok was arrested shortly after the showdown and charged with manslaughter, but he managed to post bail with the help of Owen and a few others. At his trial in early August, Tutt's allies testified that Wild Bill had already approached their friend with his gun and shot him in cold blood. Hickok's supporters countered that Tutt drew first, and both men fired simultaneously. They presented Tutt's pistol as evidence, missing a single bullet from its chamber. Believing the showdown to be a fair fight, the jury found Wild Bill innocent after only a few minutes of deliberation. The gun was enough for frontier justice to carry the day. However pointless it might have been, the killing of Davis Tutt would prove to be Hickok's ticket to Old West stardom. A few weeks after the standoff in the market square, Colonel George Ward Nichols arrived in Springfield and wrote a story about Wild Bill for Harper's New Monthly magazine. The article's account of the Tutt shooting was only mildly exaggerated, but other sections painted Hickok as a walking tall tale. Nichols wrote that Wild Bill had killed 100 men, that he once single-handedly fought off a gang of 10 bandits, and that he rode a seemingly magical horse that obeyed his every command. When the story went to print in February 1867, it immediately became a bestseller. Gushing's accounts of Wild Bill's exploits appeared in several major newspapers, and dime novelists capitalized on the public interest by penning such titles as Wild Bill, The Indian Slayer and Wild Bill's First Trail. The Harper's story made Hickok the most famous man on the frontier, and he spent the next few years adding to his legend while working variously as a wilderness scout, lawman, Wild West show performer, and gambler. He was involved in a few more shootouts in Kansas and Texas, but his duel with Davis Tutt embedded itself in the lore of the Old West. Similar quick-draw showdowns became a staple of dime novels, and they later found their way into legions of big-screen westerns such as High Noon and The Good, The Bad and The Ugly. As Wild Bill's death would eventually prove, the realities of frontier violence were usually much less alluring. In August 1876, Hickok joined a poker game at the No. 10 Saloon in the rugged mining town of Deadwood, South Dakota. The aging desperado had a habit of sitting against the wall to prevent anyone from getting the drop on him, but on that day, the only empty chair had left him with his back facing the door. While Hickok gazed down at his cards, allegedly 2 pairs of aces and eights, a man named Jack McCall crept up behind him and shot him in the back of the head at point-blank range. Wild Bill was dead before he ever had a chance to reach for his gun.
Ku Klux Klan. Founded in 1865, the Ku Klux Klan spread into almost every southern state by 1870. It became a conveyance for white Southern resistance to the Republican Party's Reconstruction-era policies to establish political and economic equality for Black Americans. Its associates waged an underground campaign of coercion and brutality directed at white and Black Republican leaders. Though Congress passed legislation designed to curb Klan terrorism, the organization saw its primary goal, the re-establishment of white supremacy, fulfilled through Democratic victories in state legislatures across the South in the 1870s. A group including many former Confederate veterans founded the first branch of the Ku Klux Klan as a social club in Pulaski, Tennessee, in 1865. The first 2 words of the organization's name are stemmed from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. In the summer of 1867, local branches of the Klan met in a general organizing convention and specified what they called an invisible empire of the South. Leading Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was chosen as the first leader, or Grand Wizard, of the Klan. He presided over a hierarchy of Grand Dragons, Grand Titans, and Grand Cyclopses. The organization of the Ku Klux Klan coincided with the beginning of the second phase of post-Civil War Reconstruction, put into place by the more radical members of the Republican Party in Congress. After declining President Andrew Johnson's relatively forgiving Reconstruction policies from 1865 to 1866, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act over the presidential veto. Under its provisions, the South was divided into 5 military districts. Each state was required to approve the 14th Amendment, which granted equal protection of the Constitution to formerly enslaved people and enacted universal male suffrage. From 1867 onward, Black participation in public life in the South became one of the most extreme elements of Reconstruction, as Black people won elections to Southern state governments and even to the U.S. Congress. For its part, the Ku Klux Klan dedicated itself to an underground campaign of violence against Republican leaders and voters, both Black and white, to reverse the policies of radical Reconstruction and restore white supremacy in the South. At least 10% of the Black legislators elected during the 1867 to 1868 constitutional conventions became victims of violence during Reconstruction, including 7 who were killed. White Republicans were criticized as carpetbaggers and scallywags. Black institutions such as schools and churches, symbols of Black liberation, were also marks for Klan attacks. By 1870, the Ku Klux Klan had branches in nearly every Southern state. Even at its height, the Klan did not boast a well-organized structure or clear leadership. Local Klan members, often wearing masks and dressed in the organization's signature long white robes and hoods, usually carried out their attacks at night, acting on their own but defending the common goals of defeating radical Reconstruction and repairing white supremacy in the South. Klan activity grew mainly in the regions of the South where Black people were a minority or a slight majority of the population and were relatively limited in others. Among the most notorious zones of Klan activity was South Carolina, where in January 1871, 500 masked men attacked the Union County Jail and lynched 8 Black prisoners. Democratic leaders would later attribute Ku Klux Klan violence to poorer Southern white people. Yet, the organization's membership crossed class lines, from small farmers and laborers to planters, lawyers, merchants, physicians, and ministers. In the regions where most Klan activity occurred, local law enforcement officials either belonged to the Klan or refused to take action against it. Even those who arrested accused Klansmen found it difficult to find witnesses willing to testify against them. Other leading white citizens in the South declined to speak out against the group's actions, giving them implied approval. After 1870, Republican state governments in the South turned to Congress for help, resulting in the passage of 3 enforcement acts, the strongest of which was the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. For the first time, The Ku Klux Klan Act designated certain crimes committed by individuals as federal offenses, including conspiracies to deny citizens the right to hold office, serve on juries and enjoy the equal protection of the law. The act authorized the president to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, arrest accused individuals without charge, and send federal forces to suppress Klan violence. This expansion of federal authority, which Ulysses S. Grant promptly used in 1871 to crush Klan activity in South Carolina and other areas of the South, outraged Democrats and even alarmed many Republicans. From the early 1870s onward, white supremacy gradually reasserted its hold on the South as support for Reconstruction weakened. By 1876, the entire South was under Democratic control once again.
Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the first United States federal law to define citizenship and affirm that the law equally protects all citizens. In the wake of the American Civil War, officials mainly planned to defend the civil rights of persons of African descent born in, or brought to the United States. The act was passed by Congress in 1866 and vetoed by United States President Andrew Johnson. In April 1866, Congress again passed the bill to back the 13th Amendment, and Johnson again vetoed it. Still, a two-thirds majority in each chamber overrode the veto to allow it to become law without a presidential signature. John Bingham and other members of Congress asserted that Congress did not yet have the sufficient constitutional power to enact this law. Following the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, Congress ratified the 1866 Act in 1870. The Act had three primary goals for the integration of African Americans into American society following the Civil War. A definition of American citizenship. The rights which come with this citizenship. The unlawfulness to deprive any person of citizenship rights based on race, color, or prior condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. The Act accomplished these three primary objectives. The author of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was United States Senator Lyman Trumbull. During the ensuing legislative process, the following key provision was deleted: there shall be no discrimination in civil rights or immunities among the inhabitants of any state or territory of the United States on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. John Bingham was an influential supporter of this deletion on the ground that courts might construe the term civil rights more broadly than people like Wilson planned. On April 5, 1866, the Senate overrode President Andrew Johnson's veto. This marked the first time the U.S. Congress ever overrode a presidential veto for a substantial piece of legislation. The federal government of the United States should protect individual citizens' rights. Senator Lyman Trumbull was the Senate sponsor of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He claimed that Congress had the power to enact it to eliminate a discriminatory badge of servitude prohibited by the 13th Amendment. Republicans within Congress were concerned with only nominal freedom for the former slaves. Congressman John Bingham, a principal author of the first section of the 14th Amendment, was one of several Republicans who considered that Congress lacked the power to pass the 1866 Act. In the 20th century, the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately adopted Trumbull's 13th Amendment rationale for congressional power to ban racial discrimination by states and private parties because the 13th Amendment does not need a state actor. To the extent that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 may have been intended to go beyond preventing discrimination by conferring certain rights on all citizens, the constitutional power of Congress to do that was more questionable. For example, Representative William Lawrence reasoned that Congress could enact the statute because of the Privileges and Immunities Clause in Article 4 of the original unamended Constitution, even though courts had suggested otherwise. In any event, there is currently no consensus that the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 purports to grant any legal benefits to white citizens. After the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 by overriding a presidential veto, some members of Congress supported the 14th Amendment to eradicate doubts about the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 or to ensure that no ensuing Congress could later repeal or alter the main provisions of that act. Therefore, the Citizenship Clause in the 14th Amendment parallels citizenship language in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and also, the Equal Protection Clause parallels non-discrimination language in the 1866 Act. The degree to which other clauses in the 14th Amendment may have blended elements of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is a matter of continuing debate. Ratification of the 14th Amendment was completed in 1868, 2 years after officials reenacted the 1866 Act as Section 18 of the Enforcement Act of 1870. After officials overrode Johnson's veto, the measure became law. Despite this accomplishment, even some Republicans who had supported the goals of the Civil Rights Act began to doubt that Congress possessed the constitutional power to turn those goals into laws. The experience provoked radical and moderate Republicans to seek constitutional guarantees for black rights rather than relying on temporary political majorities. The actions of groups such as the Ku Klux Klan undermined the act, meaning it failed to secure the civil rights of African Americans instantly. While it has been illegal in the U.S. to discriminate in employment and housing based on race since 1866, they did not provide federal penalties until the second half of the 20th century, with the passage of related civil rights legislation, which meant restoratives were left to the individuals involved, because those being discriminated against had limited or no access to legal aid. This often left many victims of discrimination without recourse.
Black Codes. The Black Codes were laws governing the conduct of African Americans. Although Black Codes existed before the Civil War and many northern states had them, southern U.S. states codified such laws in everyday practice. The best known of them were passed in 1865 and 1866 by southern states after the American Civil War to restrict African Americans' autonomy and to force them to work for low or no wages. In the first 2 years after the Civil War, white-dominated Southern legislatures passed Black Codes modeled after the earlier slave codes. Black Codes were part of more effective practice of whites trying to preserve political dominance and suppress the freedmen, newly emancipated African Americans. They were primarily concerned with controlling the movement and labor of freedmen, as a free labor system had replaced slavery. Although freedmen had been liberated, their lives were greatly restricted by the Black Codes. The defining feature of the Black Codes was broad vagrancy law, which permitted local authorities to arrest freed people for minor infractions and commit them to involuntary labor. This period started the convict lease system, also described as slavery by another name. As the Civil War ended, the U.S. Army enforced Black Codes to regulate the behavior of black people in general society. Although the Freedmen's Bureau had a mandate to protect blacks from a hostile Southern environment, it also sought to keep blacks in their place as laborers to allow production on the plantations to resume so the South could revive its economy. The Freedmen's Bureau cooperated with Southern authorities in rounding up black vagrants and placing them in contract work. In some places, it supported owners to maintain control of young, enslaved people as apprentices. In all, 21 states put in place Jim Crow laws against miscegenation. Free whites could no longer marry an enslaved person and thereby emancipate her and her children, and no freedman could accept a donation or inheritance from a white person. Soon after the end of slavery, white planters faced a labor shortage and sought a way to manage it. Although blacks did not all unexpectedly stop working, they did try to work less. In particular, many sought to reduce their Saturday work hours, and women wanted to spend more time on childcare. Southern whites also perceived black vagrancy as a sudden and dangerous social problem. Pre-existing white American belief of black inferiority informed post-war attitudes. White racial dominance continued to be culturally entrenched. Whites believed that black people were destined for servitude and that they would not work unless physically compelled. For their part, free blacks no longer felt obligated to show apparent deference to white people. The enslaved also strove to create a semi-autonomous social world, removed from the plantation and the gaze of the enslaver. The racial divisions that slavery had created directly became more apparent. Blacks also bore the brunt of Southern anger over defeat in the war. Legislation on the status of freed people was often required by constitutional conventions held in 1865. Mississippi, South Carolina, and Georgia included language in their new state constitutions, which instructed the legislature to guard them and the state against any evils that may arise from their sudden emancipation. The Florida Convention of October 1865 included a vagrancy ordinance that was in effect until lawmakers could pass black codes through the standard legislative process. 9 southern states updated their vagrancy laws in 1866. Of these, 8 allowed convict leasing, a system in which state prisons hired convicts for labor, and 5 qualified prisoner labor for public works projects. This created a system that established motivations to arrest black men, as convicts were supplied to local governments and planters as free workers. The farmers or other supervisors were responsible for their board and food, and black convicts were kept in unfortunate conditions. Because they relied on convict leasing, southern states did not build any prisons until the late 19th century. Another essential part of the codes were the annual labor contracts, which black people had to keep and present to leaders to avoid vagrancy charges. Strict punishments against theft also trapped many people in the legal system. Previously, blacks had been part of the domestic economy on a plantation and were able to use available supplies. After emancipation, the same act perpetrated by someone working the same land might be labeled theft, leading to arrest and involuntary labor. Some states explicitly curtailed black people's right to bear arms, justifying these laws with claims of imminent insurrection. In Mississippi and Alabama, legislatures enforced these laws by creating special militias. During Reconstruction, state legislatures passed some laws that established some positive rights for freedmen. States legalized black marriages and, in some cases, increased freedmen's rights to own property and conduct commerce.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm RyanGLancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.